Alyssa Monroe stepped onto the plane with a quiet confidence that naturally drew attention. She wasn't flashy or loud, but there was something about the way she carried herself, graceful yet assured, polished yet effortless. Dressed in a tailored dark green blazer over an ivory blouse, her deep brown curls were neatly pinned back, allowing her keen, observant eyes to take in her surroundings as she made her way through the first-class cabin. The weight of her leather laptop bag rested on her shoulder, her fingers lightly gripping her boarding pass. This trip was important, not just a getaway or a business meeting. It was a moment of respite she had earned after years of relentless work. She had fought for her place in the world, and this seat in first class was just another small validation of how far she had come. She found her seat, 3A, next to the window. As she settled in, she exhaled, allowing herself a moment to appreciate the plush leather seats, the extra legroom, the quiet hum of privilege that came with being in this section of the plane. This wasn't her first time in first class, but it still felt like a luxury she didn't take for granted. She reached into her bag, pulled out her notebook, and began jotting down thoughts for the upcoming meeting she had scheduled at her destination. She barely noticed when a flight attendant approached, until she heard the pointed voice. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant, Claire Jensen, said. Her tone was polite, but there was an underlying sharpness, a subtle doubt lurking beneath the surface. Alyssa looked up, momentarily taken aback by the stiffness in the woman's posture. Claire wasn't smiling the way she had been with the other passengers. "Yes," Alyssa replied, her voice calm, measured. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Alyssa blinked but didn't hesitate. She handed over the slip of paper, watching as Claire took it with just a little too much scrutiny. The flight attendant's brows furrowed as she examined the ticket, as if looking for a flaw, a reason to deny what was right in front of her. "This is for first class," Claire said, the skepticism in her voice barely concealed. "Yes," Alyssa responded, her expression neutral. "What else would it be for?" A long pause stretched between them. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening around the boarding pass as if she didn't want to hand it back. Finally she did, but there was no apology in her movements, only reluctance. "All right," Claire said stiffly. "Enjoy your flight." Alyssa exhaled slowly as the woman walked away. The interaction had been brief, but it left something heavy lingering in the air. The kind of weight she had felt many times before. The weight of someone's assumption pressing down on her, squeezing her into a space where she didn't belong, or at least where they believed she didn't. She had seen the shift in Claire's demeanor the moment she laid eyes on her. The subtle widening of the eyes, the almost imperceptible hesitation. It wasn't blatant, it wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough for Alyssa to know that, in Claire's mind, something didn't add up. Because people like Alyssa weren't the ones Claire expected to see in first class. The realization hit harder than it should have. This wasn't new. She had navigated rooms, board meetings, and high-end hotels where the looks of surprise and unwarranted skepticism followed her like shadows. And yet, no matter how much she achieved, no matter how much she proved herself, there would always be someone who questioned her right to be there. Across the aisle, an older man in a crisp navy suit watched the interaction with mild curiosity before turning back to his newspaper. A woman with pearl earrings adjusted her silk scarf, uninterested. No one spoke up, because to them, it was nothing. Just another routine check. But Alyssa knew better. She tried to brush it off, to refocus on her notes. But the sting remained. It wasn't the request itself, it was the... It was the implication. The way Claire had asked only after looking at her, as if Alyssa needed an extra layer of verification. Would she have asked if Alyssa looked different? If she fit the picture in her mind of what a first-class passenger should be? Alyssa clenched her jaw, her pen hovering above the paper but unmoving. How many times had she seen this play out before? How many times had she been doubted, questioned, subtly nudged aside? And yet, despite the familiar ache, she lifted her chin. She was here. She had earned her place. And no amount of skepticism from a flight attendant was going to take that away from her. Minutes later, Claire returned, moving through the first-class cabin with mechanical efficiency, offering pre-flight drinks and warm towels. Her tone was softer with the other passengers, her smile more genuine. But when she reached Alyssa's row, she barely met her eyes. Avoidance. It was a small thing, but Alyssa noticed. She always noticed. Instead of allowing the bitterness to take root, she exhaled, choosing something else. Grace, composure, the quiet, unshakable confidence that had gotten her to where she was. She accepted the towel, thanked Claire with a polite nod, and returned to her notes. Because at the end of the day, her presence in first class wasn't just about comfort, it was about belonging. And whether people like Claire Jensen accepted it or not, Alyssa Monroe belonged here. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Alyssa let her gaze drift out the window, watching as the world outside blurred past. The sting of the moment still lingered, but she wouldn't let it define her flight, because she was more than someone's assumption. She always had been, and she always would be. Sienna Harper had always believed in the power of patience. In her years of working tirelessly to build her career, she had learned that not every battle was meant to be fought with anger. Not every injustice required shouting. Some battles were won in silence, in restraint, in the unwavering confidence that the truth would reveal itself in time. But as she stood there, in the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin, the eyes of dozens of passengers fixed on her, she could feel the heat rising in her chest. The unfairness of it all was suffocating. Flight attendant Claire Jensen stood firmly before her, blocking her path, her expression a mixture of feigned politeness and quiet authority. "Miss Harper, I need you to move to economy class," she repeated, her voice clipped and final. The words, spoken with such cool detachment, felt like a slap. A decision had already been made, and no amount of reasoning would change it. Sienna exhaled slowly, measuring the weight of the moment. She could have argued, she should have argued. But as she glanced around the cabin, noting the subtle shift in expressions, the way some passengers averted their gazes while others watched with silent intrigue, she knew exactly what was happening. She was being tested. Her presence here was being questioned, not because of a mistake, but because of an assumption. She had seen this before. The disbelief in Claire's eyes when she had first handed over her boarding pass. The hesitation, the way she had double-checked the ticket as if expecting it to be forged. The unspoken question that lingered in the air. "Are you sure you belong here?" She was sure. The sting of humiliation was sharp, but Sienna refused to let it show. Instead, she met Claire's gaze head-on, her expression unreadable, her voice steady. "I understand," she said, her words deliberate. The first-class cabin was utterly silent now. No one spoke, no one interfered. Cowardice cloaked in quiet indifference. Sienna reached up and retrieved her bag from the overhead compartment, feeling the weight of it pressing into her shoulder. With each movement, she could feel the stares of the passengers burning into her back. Judgment, pity, curiosity. No one offered support. No one questioned what was happening. Not a single person asked if she was okay. She held her head high as she walked past the plush leather seats, the linen napkins folded neatly on the tray tables, the champagne flutes resting delicately on polished armrests. This was a world where comfort and privilege reigned, where people pretended not to see injustice when it was right in front of them. With each step, she felt the quiet resignation that often came with these moments. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. This was about something upper, something unspoken but understood. The curtains separating first class from economy swayed slightly as she passed through it, as if mocking her. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The seats were smaller, the armrests worn. The quiet luxury of first class gave way to the chatter of restless passengers, the clatter of meal trays, the hum of a crowded space that felt vastly different from where she had just been. The contrast was glaring, and Sienna felt it in her bones. A middle seat, of course. She lowered herself into it, her body stiff. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her ribs, suffocating. But she refused to let it break her. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen before she finally typed the words, "Boarded. Got moved to economy. Flight attendant refused to check my ticket properly." She hit send. A few moments passed before the reply came. "What do you mean they moved you?" Sienna's gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. Claire Jensen was back in the first-class cabin, laughing softly with another attendant, utterly unfazed by what she had just done. Another message appeared. "Give me the flight number." Sienna typed it in. There was a long pause. Then the final message came. Sit tight, this isn't over. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Sienna's lips. She straightened in her seat. She was no stranger to obstacles. She had built her career brick by brick, enduring countless moments like this. Being underestimated, being pushed aside, being forced to prove herself in ways that others never had to. And yet, here she was, still standing, still unbroken. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them in her lap, but not from fear, from something else, something stronger. She could feel the shift in the air now, the tension spreading like an undercurrent through the cabin. Some passengers had begun whispering among themselves, stealing glances at her as if they now realized something had happened that wasn't right. A flight attendant approached, a younger woman, her expression uncertain, her voice quieter than before. Ma'am, can I get you something to drink? Sienna looked up, searching the woman's face for something genuine. For the first time since this flight had begun, she saw it, a flicker of unease, of recognition. She had seen what happened. She knew. Sienna nodded once. Water would be fine. Thank you. The woman hesitated, then gave a small nod before stepping away. For the first time, Sienna exhaled, releasing the breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She turned her gaze toward the window, the soft glow of the setting sun casting golden hues over the clouds outside. The sky stretched endlessly before her, vast and untouchable. And just like that, the weight of the moment lessened. Because she knew something Claire Jensen did not. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Dignity wasn't just about holding your head high when things were easy. It was about standing your ground when the world tried to push you down. And Sienna Harper? She wasn't going anywhere. If you've ever experienced a moment like this where someone made you feel like you didn't belong, then you understand the quiet strength it takes to hold on to your dignity in the face of humiliation. Sienna didn't have to shout, she didn't have to beg. Her presence alone was enough. But should she have spoken up? Should someone else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have handled it the same way? And if you believe that strength isn't just about power, but about how we carry ourselves through adversity, then like this video, share it, and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories. Because some stories deserve to be told. And this is just the beginning. Sienna Harper sat in her cramped economy seat, her back straight, her face unreadable. The soft hum of the airplane engine filled the cabin, but she barely heard it. She was too focused on steadying her breathing, on containing the quiet storm rising within her. She had faced moments like this before, moments where she was underestimated, dismissed, made to feel as if she didn't belong. But today was different. Today, the person who had wronged her had no idea just how badly she had miscalculated. Flight attendant Claire Jensen had made a mistake, and not just by moving Sienna out of first class. She had made the mistake of assuming Sienna had no power. A soft chime broke through the cabin's murmured conversations, signaling an incoming call to the galley phone. Claire, still confident, still completely unaware of what was unfolding beyond her control, picked up the receiver. This is Jensen. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but unmistakably firm. It was the captain. Miss Jensen, I need you to confirm something for me immediately. Claire straightened slightly, glancing over her shoulder as if sensing the shift in the air. Of course, Captain. What do you need? Did you remove a passenger named Sienna Harper from first class? Her stomach twisted slightly, but she pushed down the unease. She had been so sure of herself earlier. Yes, sir. There was an issue with her booking, so I had to relocate her to economy. Silence. A long, heavy pause. Then the captain's voice, quieter this time, but sharper. Miss Jensen, are you aware of who Sienna Harper is? Claire frowned. What kind of question was that? She had dealt with high-profile passengers before, executives, celebrities, even government officials, but Sienna had not given off that kind of presence. Still, there was something in the captain's tone that made her uneasy. No, sir, she admitted cautiously. Should I be? Another silence, and then a sentence that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. Miss Harper is a major shareholder of this airline. She has direct ties to the board of directors. Claire's grip on the phone tightened. A major shareholder? She felt the blood drain from her face. The realization hit her like a gut punch. She hadn't just removed an ordinary passenger. She had humiliated one of the most powerful people in the company. Her mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, for some way to justify what she had done. But there was nothing, no excuse, no misunderstanding, just a colossal mistake born from an assumption. And now she was going to pay for it. Back in economy, Sienna remained composed, though she could sense the shift in energy. The younger flight attendant, Emma, had returned with a fresh glass of water, her expression noticeably more cautious than before. "Miss Harper," Emma said softly, carefully placing the cup on the tray table. "Is there anything else I can get you?" There was a nervousness in her voice now, a recognition of what was happening. Sienna offered her a small, polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you." Emma nodded quickly and retreated. Less than a minute later, Sienna's phone buzzed in her lap. A new message. "Miss Harper, we're aware of the situation. Please remain seated. The issue is being addressed." She exhaled slowly. It was beginning. Claire, still gripping the phone in the galley, tried to steady her breathing as the captain continued speaking. "Effective immediately, you are to personally escort Miss Harper back to her original seat in first class and offer her a formal apology." The words felt like a knife. Apologize? In front of everyone? Her chest tightened. She could already imagine the whispers, the eyes of the passengers boring into her as she walked back down that aisle with her tail between her legs. But the captain wasn't finished. "Upon landing, you will be required to report to the executive office for a formal review of this incident." The finality in his voice sent a chill down her spine. "Understood, Miss Jensen?" Claire swallowed hard. "Yes, Captain." She slowly placed the phone back on its hook, feeling like the ground had just been ripped out from under her. With stiff movements, she stepped out of the galley and turned toward economy. And there, seated calmly near the window, was Sienna Harper. She wasn't angry. She wasn't demanding. She was simply waiting. And somehow that made it worse. As Claire approached, the hushed murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers watched, eyes flicking between her and Sienna, sensing something important was happening. Stopping beside Sienna's row, Claire forced herself to breathe. This was it. The moment where the power had fully shifted. The moment where Claire had to face what she had done. She cleared her throat, but her voice still wavered slightly. "Miss Harper," she began, struggling to find the right words. "There was a misunderstanding regarding your seating. I'd like to escort you back to first class." Sienna slowly looked up at her, a beat of silence. Then quietly, "By the way, a misunderstanding?" Claire's stomach twisted. She had underestimated this woman. Badly. Her mouth felt dry as she tried again. I apologize for the inconvenience." Sienna studied her for a moment longer. Then, with a quiet grace that made the moment all the more devastating, she nodded. She was giving Claire the chance to fix her mistake. Without another word, Sienna stood. And as she walked through the aisle this time, she was not the one being humiliated. Claire followed behind her, feeling the weight of every single step, knowing that she had made a mistake she could never take back. Back in first class, Sienna settled into her original seat, placing her bag neatly beside her. A flight attendant quickly stepped forward. Not Claire. Someone higher up, someone more experienced, someone who knew exactly who she was. "Miss Harper, if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let us know." Sienna nodded but said nothing. She didn't need to, because she had already made her point. Claire stood nearby, shoulders tense, knowing that her fate had already been sealed. And Sienna? She simply picked up the in-flight magazine and flipped through the pages as if nothing had happened. Because in the end, she hadn't needed to demand respect. She had simply taken it back. And that was power. Laura Jensen had spent years perfecting the art of control. She had climbed the ranks of the airline industry, priding herself on being the type of flight attendant who never second-guessed herself. Every decision she made was final. Every command she issued was absolute. And every assumption she had about passengers, unchallenged. That was until today, until Sienna Harper. Until the phone call that sent an icy chill through Laura's entire body, making her grip on control slip right through her fingers like fine grains of sand. She could still feel the weight of the receiver in her palm, her knuckles turning white as she tried to process what she had just heard. Sienna Harper wasn't just a first-class passenger. She wasn't someone who had accidentally wandered into luxury. She wasn't someone who had bought an upgrade at the last minute. Sienna Harper was a major shareholder in the airline. Laura had humiliated her, dismissed her, treated her as if she were nothing. And now the tables had turned. Laura couldn't breathe. She barely heard the captain's voice through the phone as he laid out exactly what she had to do. Effective immediately, you are to personally escort Miss Harper back to first class. You will apologize. And when we land, you will report to the executive office for a formal review of this incident. Her fingers trembled as she hung up the phone. A review, not a warning, not a meeting, a review, which in airline terms meant a career-ending discussion. Panic crept up your spine like a slow-moving flame, licking at the edges of her confidence. What had she done? Back in economy, Sienna remained composed. She sat with an unreadable expression, but the sharp intensity in her gaze spoke volumes. She was waiting. She was patient. She had been treated unfairly, and she had done what so many others couldn't. She had fought back, and now she was winning. Sienna knew that Laura would come back. She knew that her rightful seat in first class would be restored. But it wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about principle. How many times had this happened before? How many people had been silently moved to economy, their dignity stripped away, simply because someone had assumed they didn't belong? This wasn't just about Sienna. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly. And today, for once, there would be consequences. Laura's footsteps felt unnaturally heavy as she made her way back through the aisle. Passengers were watching now, their eyes flicking up from their books, their tablets, their half-eaten meals. They had seen what had happened before. They had witnessed Laura's rigid authority when she had forced Sienna out of her seat. But now they were witnessing something else. The shift, the downfall of the person who had once controlled the room. And that, Laura realized with a sickening jolt, was why this moment felt so unbearable. She wasn't just apologizing. She was being humbled. Stopping beside Sienna's row, Laura cleared her throat. Her voice was different this time. No longer commanding, no longer firm. Now it wavered. "Miss Harper," she started, forcing a polite smile she didn't feel. "There was a misunderstanding with your booking. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat." Sienna tilted her head slightly. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. A misunderstanding? The words felt like an insult, because it hadn't been a misunderstanding. Laura had assumed that Sienna wasn't worthy of first class, and she had been so sure of herself. And now she had to face the truth. Sienna studied Laura for a long, agonizing moment before responding, her voice calm but unshakable. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated softly. Laura swallowed hard. "Yes," she lied. "I apologize for the inconvenience." The silence between them stretched. Laura wanted this to be over. She wanted to turn back time and make a different choice. She wanted to believe that this wouldn't follow her beyond this flight, that she could walk away from it with her dignity intact. But it was too late, because now it wasn't about what Laura wanted. It was about what Sienna deserved, and she deserved better. Sienna stood slowly, deliberate in every movement. The passengers watching knew. They understood that what they were witnessing wasn't just a passenger being given her seat back. They were witnessing a reckoning. They were witnessing what happened when someone in power abused it and then had to answer for it. Sienna picked up her bag, her steps measured and steppered as she walked through the aisle. And Laura? Laura followed, the way Sienna had been forced to follow her before. And that was the moment Laura knew. Her days as a flight attendant were over. As Sienna settled back into her seat in first class, another attendant, not Laura, stepped forward. A superior, someone much higher up in the airline, someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "Miss Harper," he said with the utmost respect, "if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask." Sienna nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that the moment had passed. She had already won. Because now, the people who had ignored her before were scrambling to make things right. And Laura? She stood nearby, her uniform feeling too tight, her face flushed with humiliation. For the first time, she was powerless, and she hated it. This is what happens when you assume someone's worth based on your own prejudice. This is what happens when you make a mistake you can't take back. And this, dear listener, is why you should always, always treat people with respect. Sienna Harper didn't demand justice. She simply let it come to her. And today, it did. Laura Jensen had never been the type to question herself. In her 10 years as a flight attendant, she had learned that confidence was key. Passengers listened when you spoke with authority. They obeyed when you stood firm. They backed down when you refused to waver. But today, none of that was working. Because today, Laura was not the one in control. Today, she was the one being summoned. She could still hear the captain's voice in her head, cold and final, as he delivered the message that sent her world spiraling out of control. Security will be waiting for you at the gate. The words had struck her like a slap, knocking the breath from her lungs. Security? For her? This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was the one who enforced the rules. She was the one who maintained order. She was the one with the power, but now she was powerless. The moment the plane touched down, a suffocating tension settled in Laura's chest. She moved through her post-landing duties mechanically, her fingers trembling as she adjusted tray tables and cleared away the last remnants of the flight. Her usual confidence? Gone. Her authority? Shattered. She could feel the eyes of the crew on her, though no one dared to speak. They had all heard, they all knew. Laura was in trouble. Real trouble. And the worst part? She deserved it. As passengers gathered their belongings, Laura forced herself to breathe. She had options. Maybe she could explain. Maybe she could fix this. Maybe if she apologized again, really apologized this time, she could undo the damage before it was too late. But then she saw her, Sienna Harper, the woman she had humiliated, the woman she had wronged, the woman who had exposed her for exactly what she was, and she wasn't rushing. She wasn't eager to escape the plane like so many other passengers. No, she was waiting, watching, and when her gaze met Laura's, it was over. The moment the doors opened, the uniformed officers were there, standing tall, waiting for her. Passengers paused, whispering in hushed tones, exchanging glances as the scene unfolded. This was no random security check. This was a reckoning, and everyone knew it. Miss Jensen? The officer's voice was firm but professional, giving Laura one last chance to compose herself. Her legs felt weak as she stepped forward, the weight of every mistake she had made pressing down on her chest like a crushing force. The whispers around her grew louder. Passengers stared, some wide-eyed, others exchanging knowing looks. They had seen what had happened earlier. They had watched her force Sienna to move, and now they were watching her fall. The irony wasn't lost on Laura. Moments ago, she had commanded respect. Now she was a cautionary tale. As she followed the officers into the terminal, her hands trembled. The sterile white walls of the airport had never felt so cold. She had walked through these halls 100 times before, but never like this. Never with the knowledge that her career, her entire reputation, was hanging by a thread. And the worst part? She had done it to herself. Inside a private conference room, Laura sat alone, her fingers twisting anxiously in her lap. The silence was unbearable. She could still feel the stares of passengers lingering on her skin. She could still hear the whispers. She had spent years telling herself she was just doing her job, that her instincts were never wrong, that she was the authority. But today had proven just how wrong she was, and now she had to answer for it. The door opened, and a woman in a dark gray suit entered. She was calm, composed, powerful, everything Laura had once been. She placed a folder on the table and opened it with a deliberate slowness that made Laura's stomach twist. Then, without preamble, she said, "Do you understand why you're here?" Laura swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper. She wanted to argue, she wanted to defend herself, but she couldn't, because for the first time in her life, she had no defense. The next words sealed her fate. "Miss Jensen, your actions on today's flight were unacceptable. The airline has a zero-tolerance policy for bias and discriminatory behavior. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty pending further review." The air left her lungs, suspended. Not a warning, not a slap on the wrist, suspended. and everyone would know her career was over, her reputation destroyed, all because she had made a snap judgment that she could never take back. Across the airport, Sienna Harper sat by the window, sipping her coffee as she scrolled through her phone. She had just received confirmation that the airline would be reviewing its policies and implementing mandatory bias training. She had won. But more importantly, she had changed something. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed. Every person who had ever been judged unfairly. Every person who had been told, without words, that they didn't belong. Today, she had proved that they did, and that was justice. Laura never saw it coming. She never thought that one decision, one moment of unchecked bias, would cost her everything. But that's the thing about power. If you abuse it, you lose it. And today, she lost everything. The weight of injustice isn't just in the moment it happens. It's in the knowledge that it has happened before and that it will happen again unless something changes. Sienna Harper knew this better than anyone. She had been humiliated, publicly dismissed, treated as if she didn't belong. And while she had gotten an apology, while she had reclaimed her rightful seat, she knew that wasn't enough. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been judged unfairly. Every person who had been silenced. Every person who had been made to feel invisible. Sienna refused to let this become just another story. No, she was going to change the system. The morning after the flight, her phone rang. The airline's CEO, Gregory Hale, was on the line. His voice was measured, cautious, the voice of a man trying to contain a fire before it spread. Sienna, I'd like to personally extend my apologies, he began, the words practiced and polished. She let him speak. She let him say all the right things. But then, when he was done, she simply asked, "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" Silence. The kind of silence that made people uncomfortable. Sienna didn't feel it. She wanted him to feel it, to sit in the weight of the question. Because an apology was not a solution, and she had no interest in empty words. The following week, Sienna sat at the head of a polished conference table, surrounded by senior airline executives who suddenly looked very nervous. Her presence alone had changed the power dynamic. No longer was she just a passenger. Now she was the force demanding accountability. One by one, the executives spoke about existing policies, their voices tight with discomfort as they tried to justify what had happened to her. Sienna listened. She took notes. And then, when they were done, she set down her pen and looked each of them in the eye. "Tell me," she said, her voice calm but unshakable, "how many times has something like this happened before?" No one spoke, because they knew. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't have even been the last, unless something changed. Sienna came prepared. She had spent days gathering stories from others, passengers, employees, even former flight attendants who had witnessed or experienced similar injustices. A pattern emerged, and it was never just one bad apple. It was a culture that encouraged assumptions, a culture that allowed bias to go unchecked, a culture that needed to be dismantled. And Sienna, she wasn't asking for change. She was demanding it. By the end of the meeting, the airline had no choice but to act, because this wasn't just a private issue anymore. People were watching. The media had picked up the story. Social media had exploded with discussions about her experience. The airline was in damage control mode. But for Sienna, this wasn't about PR fixes. It was about making sure this never happened again. And so, with every demand she made, she didn't back down. Not when they tried to minimize it. Not when they tried to offer quiet settlements to make it disappear. Not when they suggested small internal reviews instead of real systemic changes. No, she refused to let them make this about her. Because it wasn't. It was about the next person. And the person after that. It was about every person who had been told, without words, that they didn't belong. 3 weeks later, the airline made an announcement. Mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all employees. A new policy requiring multiple verifications before any passenger could be removed from their seat. A direct line for passengers to report discrimination and mistreatment. A full review of their internal hiring and promotion practices to ensure diversity at every level. And at the bottom of the official statement, a single name, Sienna Harper. A passenger who refused to be dismissed. A woman who turned her humiliation into something greater. A voice that they couldn't ignore. In the weeks that followed, Sienna received countless messages from passengers who had experienced the same treatment, from employees who had been afraid to speak up, from strangers who simply wanted to say thank you. She had never wanted to be an activist. She had never set out to change the industry, but sometimes life forces you to stand up. And when that moment comes, you either take the opportunity or you let the system win. Sienna had made her choice, and she had no regrets. Months later, she found herself back at the airport. This time, she wasn't a passenger fighting for respect. She was a consultant, sitting in a room full of executives from multiple airlines, speaking about how to change the industry for the better. As she finished her presentation, the room erupted in applause. And for the first time since that fateful flight, Sienna felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Hope, because change had begun. And this was just the beginning. Laura Harper had spent over a decade working as a flight attendant. She was confident, respected, and in control. At least, that's what she had always believed. She had worn her uniform with pride, held her head high in the face of difficult passengers, and upheld the rules of the airline without hesitation. She had convinced herself that her judgments were always right, always justified. Until now. Now she sat alone in a sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters, staring blankly at the termination notice in front of her. The words blurred not from exhaustion, but from shame. She had thought she was untouchable, but she wasn't. And the worst part? She had done this to herself. The disciplinary hearing had been the hardest moment of her life. 3 senior airline executives sat across from her, their expressions cold, their eyes filled with judgment. She had been on the other side of this before. She had been the one making decisions about who belonged and who didn't. Now it was her turn to be judged. Miss Harper, the woman in the center had said, her voice clipped and professional. You've been with the airline for over 10 years. Do you understand why we're here today? Laura had swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. Yes, she whispered. Then tell us, the executive continued, in your own words, why are you here? The question had made her chest tighten. How was she supposed to answer that? Because I made an assumption? Because I thought someone didn't belong in first class? Because I was so sure of myself that I didn't even check the ticket? Because I humiliated the wrong person? Her throat felt dry. I made a mistake. A mistake, the male executive repeated. His voice was sharp, emotionless. Miss Harper, do you consider publicly dismissing a paying passenger without verifying their credentials a simple mistake? Laura clenched her jaw. She wanted to defend herself, to say she had just been following protocol, that she had acted on instinct. But she knew the truth. She had judged Sienna Harper not by her ticket, but by something else. Something ugly. Something she could no longer deny. I was wrong, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Saying the words out loud burned. The executives nodded, but there was no satisfaction in their expressions. Just disappointment. Miss Harper, the woman at the center of the table continued, the airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Given the nature of this incident and the public attention it has received, we have decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. The words hit her like a slap. A decade of work, a decade of dedication, long hours, sacrifices, gone. For a single decision. No, not a single decision. A lifetime of them. And for the first time in her career, Laura Harper had to face herself. The days after her termination were the worst of her life. She tried to rationalize what had happened. She told herself she had been unlucky, that it was unfair, that she had just followed her instincts. But instincts aren't always right. Her phone rang constantly at first. Former coworkers, acquaintances, family members, offering words of sympathy, confusion, or judgment. Then, after the story spread, the call stopped. She became radioactive. No airline would touch her. Her entire reputation had been stained. For the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be dismissed, what it felt like to lose everything in an instant. She spent nights staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over again. The way she had looked at Sienna and assumed she didn't belong, the way she had dismissed her ticket, her words, her dignity, and most of all, the way Sienna had handled it. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't begged. She had simply stood her ground. And in doing so, she had exposed Laura's greatest flaw. Laura had spent her whole career believing she was fair, that she was a good person, that she followed the rules. But the truth was simple. She had let bias cloud her judgment, and it had cost her everything. One night, unable to sleep, Laura opened her laptop. She hesitated for a long moment, staring at the blank screen. Then, with trembling fingers, she started to type. An apology. Not an excuse, not a justification, just the truth. It took her hours. Every word felt like a confession. When she was done, she read it back, her hands shaking. Then, with a deep breath, she hit send. 2 days later, Sienna received the email. She didn't open it right away. When she finally did, she read each line slowly, carefully. At the end, she let out a slow breath. She had expected anger, defensiveness. But this was something else. Regret, recognition, a genuine understanding of what had been lost. She typed a short response. Accountability is the first step. I hope you continue down this path. She hit send, and with that, Laura's journey truly began. In the months that followed, Laura rebuilt herself. She took a job at a nonprofit dedicated to fighting workplace discrimination. She worked with people who had been silenced, dismissed, and ignored. And for the first time in her life, she listened. Really, truly listened. She knew she couldn't erase what she had done, but she could change who she was. And that was something. We all make mistakes, but what we do after those mistakes, that's what defines us. Laura Harper learned that the hard way, but she learned. And maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. Laura Harper sat in the dim glow of her small apartment, her laptop screen the only source of light in the otherwise dark room. It had been months since she lost everything, her career, her reputation, and most importantly, the confidence she once had in herself. At first, she had resisted. She told herself the airline had been unfair, that she was just doing her job. She tried to convince herself that Sienna Harper had overreacted, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew the truth. Every night when she closed her eyes, she saw Sienna's calm, unwavering expression, the quiet dignity of a woman who had been wronged but never lowered herself to anger. She saw the moment Sienna locked eyes with her, unafraid, unapologetic. It haunted her. For the first time in her life, Laura Harper felt the weight of her own bias. She had spent years priding herself on being a professional, a woman who followed the rules, who knew how the world worked. But now she realized that she had never questioned those rules. She had never stopped to ask herself whether the power she had been given was being used fairly. And because of that, she had humiliated a woman in front of an entire plane of people. She had made her feel small. Now the only thing left was the regret. And so, with trembling hands, she typed, "Dear Ms. Harper, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say this, I was wrong. Not just in what I did, but in how I thought about people. I assumed something about you that I had no right to assume. I let my own prejudice guide my decision, and in doing so, I took away your dignity in a way that I can never undo. When I told you to move, I didn't see you as a valued passenger. I saw you as someone who didn't belong. And that's something I have to live with. Losing my job made me angry at first, but now I see that my biggest loss wasn't my career. It was the respect I had for myself. I have spent months reflecting on this, and I want you to know that I am making changes. I have joined an organization that works to combat bias in the workplace, and I am actively trying to unlearn the harmful beliefs that led me to that moment. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you this. I am sorry. Laura Harper." Laura hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity. Would Sienna even read it? Would she laugh at her attempt to make amends? Would she delete it without a second thought? She exhaled sharply and clicked send. Then she closed her laptop and waited. Days passed, then a week. No response. Laura told herself she hadn't expected one, but the silence stung. She tried to move forward. She continued attending diversity and inclusion workshops, surrounding herself with voices she had ignored for so long. She learned about the quiet pain of being dismissed, of being underestimated, of being judged for things beyond one's control. She sat in rooms full of people who had been through exactly what Sienna had gone through that day on the plane. And she listened. For the first time in her life, she truly listened. She thought she had understood loss when she lost her job, but now she understood that her loss was nothing compared to what she had taken from others. Then one morning, her phone buzzed. It was a simple email. Her hands shook as she clicked it open. Laura, thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step. I hope you continue down this path. Sienna Harper. Laura stared at the words. No anger, no resentment, no cruelty, just acknowledgement. And in some small way, forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation to friendship. It wasn't absolution. But it was enough. Tears blurred Laura's vision as she clutched the phone to her chest. Sienna had every right to ignore her. She had every right to never give her a second thought. But she had chosen to acknowledge Laura's apology. She had chosen to let her move forward. Laura knew she would never undo what she had done. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she had the chance to become someone better. Months later, Laura stood in front of a small group of trainees at the nonprofit organization where she now worked. She took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone. I was a flight attendant for over 10 years, she began. I thought I knew everything about customer service, about treating people fairly. But I didn't. I judged people by how I thought they should look, should act, should be. She paused, looking at the group before her. I made a mistake, and I lost everything because of it. Some people in the audience nodded, some looked skeptical, but all of them listened. I'm not here to tell you I'm a good person now, Laura continued. I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm here to tell you what I learned the hard way. Bias doesn't always look like hatred. Sometimes it looks like a simple assumption, a snap judgment, a moment of thinking you know better. But that one moment can change someone's entire world. She exhaled, steadying herself. The best thing we can do is hold ourselves accountable, not just when it's easy, not just when it's expected, but when it's hard. She looked down at her notes, at a small email reply printed at the bottom of the page. She had kept it. It reminded her that change was possible, even for people like her. She lifted her gaze. So let's do better. Let's be better, because I promise you, it's never too late to start. The room was silent for a moment, then a single clap, then another, and another, until the entire room was applauding. Laura felt a lump in her throat, not because she was being praised, but because she knew this moment wasn't about her. It was about the message. It was about change. And for the first time in a long, long time, Laura Harper finally felt worthy of the second chance she had been given. What do you think? Have you ever had to confront a mistake that changed your life? Do you believe in redemption and second chances? Comment below and share your thoughts. And if you believe in growth, learning, and the power of change, don't forget to like this story to show your support, because no one is beyond redemption. And sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most important destinations. Sienna Harper sat in her office, staring out the window as the city lights flickered against the darkening sky. It had been months since that flight, since the moment she had been humiliated, dismissed, and stripped of the respect she rightfully deserved. But now things were different. That one moment of unfairness, that one incident of discrimination, had turned into something much bigger than she had ever imagined. What started as one person's fight for justice had transformed into a movement, a battle that was no longer just about her, but about every single person who had ever been unfairly judged, dismissed, or treated as though they didn't belong. But Sienna knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. A battle that became bigger than one person. In the weeks following the flight, the airline had tried to quietly sweep things under the rug, issuing standard apologies, making vague promises about internal reviews, and hoping the story would fade into the background like so many others before it. But Sienna refused to let it go. She had seen it happen too many times, people treated unfairly, forced to accept an apology that meant nothing, and then expected to move on as if nothing had ever happened. But she wasn't going to be one of those people. She had power, knowledge, and influence, and she was going to use it. With every press interview, every meeting with corporate executives, and every message she received from strangers who had been through similar experiences, she realized something that made her heart ache and burn with determination at the same time. This wasn't just her story. This was the story of thousands of others, people who had been wrongly judged, unfairly profiled, and dismissed because of someone else's assumptions. And if she had the voice to speak for them, she would. Sienna used every resource at her disposal, her legal team, public pressure, media attention, to hold the airline accountable. It wasn't enough for them to say they were sorry. She wanted real reform. She demanded mandatory sensitivity training for all flight attendants, new policies that required multiple levels of verification before a passenger could be removed from their seat, and an independent committee to oversee complaints of discrimination and bias within the airline. The executives had been hesitant at first, resistant to real change, but Sienna didn't back down. She wouldn't be ignored, and neither would the voices of the people who had reached out to her, passengers who had been mistreated, employees who had suffered from bias within the system, and those who had stayed silent for too long. She gathered statements, she built a case, and she made sure the airline knew that if they didn't take real action, the public would see exactly who they were protecting and who they were willing to throw aside. Her persistence paid off. Under intense scrutiny, the airline was forced to act. They agreed to all her demands, announcing sweeping policy changes, new employee training programs, and a public commitment to ensuring what happened to her would never happen again. For the first time in years, a major airline was forced to confront its internal biases, not just with words, but with real measurable action. But this wasn't just about one airline. As news of the changes spread, other airlines began to take notice. Major carriers across the country started reviewing their policies, reevaluating their staff training, and implementing new guidelines to prevent the same mistakes from happening on their flights. Sienna's case had shaken the entire industry. She had set a precedent. She had proven that one person's voice could create real change, but only if they refused to be silenced. The messages she received in the months that followed were overwhelming. Because of what you did, I finally had the courage to report the way I was treated last year. Thank you for speaking up for people like me. I work as a flight attendant, and your story made my airline completely change how they train us. It's about time. For years, I let things like this happen to me and never spoke up. You inspired me to finally fight back. Each message reminded her why she had fought so hard, because this was never just about her. This was about every person who had been treated unfairly and told to accept it. This was about every worker in the airline industry who had watched bias go unchecked and felt powerless to stop it. This was about proving that fairness and dignity weren't privileges, they were rights. Sienna knew she hadn't done this alone. The people who had stood by her, believed in her, and fought alongside her had made this victory possible. To those people, she had a message. To every single person who shared my story, who demanded accountability, who refused to let this be ignored, thank you. You made this happen. You proved that together we have power. And because of you, the world is a little more just today than it was yesterday. And to those still facing injustice, discrimination, and mistreatment, she had one more thing to say. Don't ever let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. Don't ever let them convince you that speaking up won't change anything. It does. It always does. The only way they win is if you stay silent. So don't. Fight back. Demand better. And know that you are not alone. Sienna's story is a powerful reminder that when we stand up against injustice, we can change the world. But this fight isn't over. We need more voices, more people willing to speak up, and more support for those who refuse to accept unfair treatment. If you believe in justice, fairness, and standing up for what's right, show your support by liking this story to spread awareness, commenting words of encouragement for those still fighting battles of their own, subscribing to hear more stories of strength, resilience, and change. Because when we support each other, when we refuse to be silent, we win. Sienna's fight may have started on one flight, but its impact will last forever. The months that followed were nothing short of life-changing, not just for Sienna Harper, but for the entire airline industry. What started as one humiliating moment had sparked a ripple effect so powerful that it was impossible to ignore. For Sienna, justice had been served. She had fought against bias, mistreatment, and arrogance, and she had won. But more importantly, she had set a precedent, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. For Laura Harper, the journey had been different. The fall from grace had been swift and brutal, leaving her with a shattered reputation and an uncertain future. But the story didn't end with her downfall. It ended with her redemption. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come from our worst mistakes. Laura's redemption, a new beginning. After being terminated from the airline, Laura Harper felt lost. She had spent a decade believing that her authority was unquestionable, that her gut feelings were always right, and that power meant control. But one decision, one assumption, one moment of unchecked bias had destroyed everything. At first, she was angry, not at the airline, not at Sienna, but at herself. She spent weeks replaying that moment in her mind, trying to understand how she could have been so blind, so wrong. Then, something unexpected happened. One evening while scrolling through emails, she noticed a message from Sienna. It was short but powerful. Growth comes from accountability. If you're ready to learn, let's talk. Laura hesitated for a long time before responding, but deep down she knew this was the moment that would define her future. She accepted Sienna's offer. Their first conversation was difficult, raw, honest, emotional. Sienna didn't hold back. She told Laura exactly how it felt to be judged, dismissed, and humiliated. She told her about the countless others who had gone through the same thing but never got justice. And for the first time, Laura truly listened, not to defend herself, not to justify her actions, but to understand. That was the moment her real transformation began. Determined to make amends, Laura immersed herself in diversity and inclusion training. She studied cases of bias in the workplace, attended seminars on unconscious prejudice, and worked tirelessly to educate herself on the very issues she had once ignored. Months later, she received an offer for a new job, not as a flight attendant, but as a consultant for a nonprofit that specialized in workplace equity and inclusion. Instead of enforcing rules based on assumption, she was now teaching others how to break those harmful cycles. Laura had lost her old identity, but she had found something better, a purpose. And Sienna, she wasn't just proud, she was hopeful. Because if someone like Laura could change, then maybe, just maybe, this world could too. While Laura rebuilt her life, Sienna continued advocating for change. Her case had not only forced the airline to implement new policies, but it had also sparked national conversation about bias in customer service industries. She was invited to speak at conferences, leadership panels, and industry events, sharing her experience in pushing for stronger protections against discrimination in all workplaces. She also started a foundation dedicated to helping people who had been unfairly targeted by workplace bias. Her inbox overflowed with messages from people who had experienced similar injustices, some who had suffered in silence for years. Thank you for speaking out. You gave me the courage to fight back. I never thought my voice mattered, but now I'm taking a stand. Because of you, I refuse to accept mistreatment at my job. You changed my life. Reading those messages, Sienna felt something she hadn't before. She wasn't alone, and neither was anyone else. That realization made every battle, every struggle, and every moment of doubt worth it. This isn't just Sienna's story. This isn't just Laura's redemption. This is about all of us. Because whether we realize it or not, we've all been in this story before. We've all been Sienna, wronged, judged, dismissed, and treated unfairly. We've all been Laura, guilty of making assumptions, blind to our biases, and unaware of how our actions affect others. And just like them, we have a choice. A choice to speak up when we see injustice. A choice to learn from our mistakes and do better. A choice to treat every single person we meet with dignity, fairness, and respect. Because at the end of the day, power is temporary. Authority can be taken away. But the way we treat people, that is what defines us. As Sienna walked through the airport months later, this time boarding a flight where she was greeted warmly, treated with respect, and welcomed without question, she felt something that had once seemed impossible. Peace. She had fought for fairness, and she had won. Not just for herself, but for everyone who came after her. And as for Laura, she wasn't the same person anymore. She had once thought that losing her job meant losing everything. But in reality, it had given her something much greater. A chance to grow, to change, and to help others do the same. Always question your assumptions. Don't judge someone by their appearance, their background, or your own preconceived notions. Give people the respect they deserve. Hold yourself accountable. If you make a mistake, own it. Apologize, learn from it, and most importantly, do better. Use your voice. If you see injustice, speak up. Change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we demand better. Believe in second chances. Growth is possible. People can change. And when they do, they deserve the chance to prove it. Sienna's story is proof that one voice can create real change. But it doesn't stop with her. It continues with all of us. And that's why we need you. If you believe in fairness, respect, and justice, show your support. Like this video if you believe in fighting for what's right. Comment below to encourage those who are standing up for change. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another inspiring story.